desert wind howls, carrying whispers of forgotten pride and hidden healing. Somewhere between the palace of Damascus and the muddy waters of the Jordan, a man wrapped in glory was dying in silence. His name was Naaman, the commander of the Syrian army, a hero to his king but a stranger to his own skin. Under the shining armor that terrified nations, leprosy was eating him alive, quietly, cruelly, relentlessly. And then came the strangest command any soldier had ever received. Go and wash yourself in the Jordan River 7 times. But the Jordan was dirty, unworthy, unholy in his eyes. Why would the God of Israel choose filth to make a man clean? What secret was hidden beneath those brown waters? And why did a foreign general's healing shake empires and faith itself? Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. And if stories like this one move your heart, make sure to subscribe. Imagine the sun burning over the ancient sands of Aram, Damascus, where the air smelled of iron, incense, and victory. The people bowed when their general passed, a man carved from battle, adorned in bronze and kissed by triumph. Yet under the polished armor a secret rot was spreading. The mighty Naaman, conqueror of kingdoms, was losing the quiet war against his own body. In every shadow of his tent, he hid his hands. In every feast he smiled too long. He was the kind of man who could silence a room with a glance, but not the disease that whispered across his skin. And in that silence of pride and pain, a story of divine irony began to unfold. Naaman's name carried weight. His victories fed songs across the land. But even power cannot bribe heaven, and even kings cannot command a cure. His leprosy was more than sickness, it was a mirror. A reflection of human pride standing before divine mercy. Far away in the humble land of Israel, there lived a young servant girl, nameless in history, but not in heaven. She had once been taken captive during war, torn from her homeland, yet her faith remained unbroken. In her heart burned a whisper of compassion for the very man who had conquered her people. She said to Naaman's wife, "If only my master would go to the prophet in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." That sentence, and small, fragile, almost lost in the noise of the palace, would change the course of history. But what made this moment divine was not just the miracle that would follow. It was the path to humility that God would carve through Naaman's soul. Sometimes heaven does not send thunder or chariots. It sends discomfort, confusion, and the breaking of pride. Imagine the road Naaman took, golden dust rising behind royal chariots. Carrying gifts of silver, gold, and fine linen, he expected a prophet to meet him with ceremony, to call upon the heavens, to wave a hand over the disease. But instead the door barely opened. A messenger stepped out and spoke the words that shattered his pride. "Go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored." The Jordan, muddy, small, and ordinary. It was not the kind of river that inspired faith. It was the kind of water people avoided. Naaman's fury rose like the heat of the desert. He turned away, shouting, "Are not the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" He wanted the miracle to fit his dignity. He wanted healing without humiliation. But heaven does not heal what pride still protects. In that moment, the story of Naaman became more than a tale of skin and water. It became a revelation of how God hides purity in the unclean, strength in surrender, and wisdom in humility. The miracle was not only about his body. It was about the death of arrogance and the birth of obedience. Today, centuries later, we walk our own deserts, filled with invisible leprosy, pride, doubt, resentment. We too question why God asks us to step into places we despise. We want miracles that look clean, paths that feel noble, prayers that come easy. But what if, like Naaman, the very place we refuse to go is the one that holds our healing? What if faith begins where dignity ends? Because sometimes God chooses a dirty river, not to shame us, but to show us that His grace is deeper than any mud. But what if I told you? The truth of Naaman's story was hidden in plain sight all along. The night was still in Damascus. The stars hung low like watchful eyes, their glow reflecting off the marble towers of the Aramean Empire. Somewhere within those high walls, beneath the scent of cedar and iron, a child was born into destiny, Naaman, son of the northern winds, heir to the silence of battlefields yet to come. They said he was born during a storm, when thunder struck near the city gates, and lightning danced across the sky like the sword of heaven itself. The midwives trembled, whispering that such a birth meant something. In ancient lands, storms were messages, not accidents. They believed that when thunder spoke, God was watching closely. Naaman grew in that belief and that he was chosen. His childhood was not filled with tenderness but with commands. His father, a soldier of renown, placed a sword in his hand before he learned to write his name. In Damascus, honor was forged through blood and silence. He learned early that to survive was to conquer, and to conquer was to be seen. The city was the jewel of Aram, its walls thick with pride, its markets alive with gold and gossip. Priests chanted before idols of bronze, smoke rose from altars, and kings were praised as gods. Yet amid this splendor, Naaman's eyes were always drawn to something else, to the horizon, where dust and light kissed the edge of eternity. Even as a boy, he carried a strange restlessness, as if he sensed that his life's story would not end in Damascus. Years passed. Naaman became a man of war, and swift, sharp, and merciless. He fought not for glory but for purpose. Legends began to bloom around his name. In the markets, mothers would whisper, "Naaman rides again," and children would mimic the sound of horses thundering behind him. His victories filled scrolls, and his king, Ben-Hadad II, saw in him more than a warrior. He saw a symbol. But symbols come with burdens. Each battle hardened Naaman's soul and carved lines of quiet arrogance upon his face. He began to believe that he was untouchable, that perhaps the gods truly favored him above all. When he returned from battle, the people scattered petals beneath his horse's hooves. When he entered the palace, even priests bowed, and yet, when he looked at his reflection in the bronze mirror, he saw something no one else could see. A faint discoloration on his skin, like dust refusing to wash away. At first, he ignored it. The mighty do not fall to trifles. But as weeks turned into months, that dust became a shadow. The shadow became a stain, and the stain became fear. In the stillness of night, he would wake to scratch the burning beneath his armor, terrified of what he could not name. Leprosy. The word itself was a death sentence, a slow exile from the world of men, Naaman's attendants whispered. Servants looked away when he passed. The baths he once used were now emptied after his touch, and though his victory still echoed through the city, his body had begun to betray him. He stood one evening at his window, looking over the torches flickering across Damascus. The scent of oil and dust filled the air. How cruel, he thought, that a man who conquered armies cannot conquer a blemish. In those moments, the silence was heavier than any sword he had ever lifted. Then came the day of the Euphrates battle, when Aram fought fiercely against Assyria. Naaman led his men like a storm, unrelenting, unyielding. Arrows rained from the sky. The earth shook beneath the clash of iron, and blood painted the soil red. When victory was finally won, songs rose across the camps, songs praising Naaman the invincible. Yet even as they sang beneath his armor, he bled not from a wound of war, but from the cracks on his skin. Pride made him smile before men. Pain made him weep before God, though he did not yet know his name. And then fate entered quietly, wearing the face of a young Israelite girl. She had been taken captive during one of Naaman's raids, a child torn from the smoke of Samaria, brought to serve his wife. She spoke little, moved gently, and carried an air of sorrow mixed with peace. There was something unsettling in her gaze, as if she knew truths that even generals did not. One morning, as she poured water into her mistress's basin, she saw the way Naaman's wife wiped away her tears. She had seen the general's bandaged hands, the stains beneath his robes, and in a moment of courage, the girl whispered words that would echo through eternity. "If only my master were with the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman's wife froze. The words hung in the air like divine music. Could it be true? Could the God of Israel heal what no man in Aram could? When Naaman heard, he laughed, not in mockery but in disbelief. He had heard of prophets, yes, men who called fire from heaven, who divided waters, who spoke to unseen forces. But that was Israel, a defeated nation, a people his army had conquered. Could salvation truly come from the land he had humiliated? Still, hope is a strange seed. It grows even in the soil of pride. He went to his king Ben-Hadad and told him the words of the servant girl. The king, desperate to keep his hero alive, sent letters and treasures to the king of Israel, silver, gold, and garments, a diplomatic plea wrapped in wealth. "Heal my servant," the letter said, "that he may serve me again." But when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes in despair. "Am I God?" he cried. "Can I kill and bring back to life? See how this man seeks a quarrel with me." In those days, the name of Elisha, the prophet of the living God, carried power. When Elisha heard that the king had torn his clothes, he sent a message. "Let Naaman come to me, and he shall know that there is a prophet in Israel." And thus, the path of miracle was set, not in the halls of kings, but on the dusty road to Samaria. Naaman prepared his chariots. He carried silver, gold, and 10 fine garments, gifts fit for a god, not a prophet. The road stretched endlessly beneath the burning sun, winding through deserts and hills. Along the way, he wondered if this was folly. Yet something within him, perhaps the same voice that had driven him to every victory, now whispered, "Go." When he reached the prophet's house, his soldiers formed ranks, their armor gleaming in the light. Naaman expected ceremony, incense, chanting, divine spectacle. Instead, a simple messenger stepped out. No prophet appeared. No miracle was performed. The man said softly, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." Naaman froze. His pride shattered into fury. "The Jordan?" he roared. "The filthy river of Israel? Are not Abana and Pharpar, rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of this land?" He turned his chariot sharply, dust rising like smoke behind him. The prophet's door closed without a word. And in that silence, in that humiliating silence, the heavens began to move. Because sometimes, the divine does not shout from mountaintops. It waits patiently in the mud of a river we refuse to touch. As Naaman's chariot thundered away, his soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, trembling, finally spoke. "My father, if the prophet had asked you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he says, 'Wash and be clean'?" Those words, unspoken by a servant, pierced deeper than any sword. Naaman said nothing, but deep inside something cracked. That night he camped near the Jordan. The air smelled of water and dust. The moon trembled on the surface of the river like a hidden eye. He stood there watching the slow current, thinking of every battle, every victory, every idol, every tear. Could this really be the place where God would meet him? Not in a palace, not on a mountain, but here, like in a river so unworthy that even his reflection looked strange within it. He took a deep breath. The wind shifted. The night whispered. Somewhere an unseen presence was watching, and that's when the prophecy began to unfold. The night before, the decision was cold. The moonlight rippled across the surface of the Jordan, pale and trembling like a secret kept too long. Naaman sat by the riverbank, his armor beside him, his hands wrapped in linen. The hum of crickets filled the air, but his heart was louder, an endless rhythm of pride and pain. He had bathed in the rivers of Damascus, where marble steps descended into clear, flowing water. The Jordan was nothing like that. It was muddy, quiet, unremarkable, a peasant stream compared to the royal waters of home. And yet it called to him. Every whisper of the current seemed to say, "Bend and be made whole." But bending was harder for a general than bleeding. He stared at his reflection, the faint moonlight revealing the white patches on his skin, the rot beneath the bandages. For the first time in years, Naaman did not see a commander. He saw a man, fragile, frightened, and furious at the heavens. "Why here?" he muttered. "Why this river? Why this humiliation?" No answer came, only the wind shifting across the reeds. Inside the camp, his men were silent. They could feel the tension, the kind that fills the air before a storm. These soldiers had followed Naaman into every kind of battle, but tonight they watched their general fight something invisible. Pride, doubt, fear. The young soldier who had spoken earlier, the one who had urged obedience, approached quietly. His voice trembled but held truth. "My lord, I have seen you defy death. I have seen you face armies 10 times your size, yet you stand here afraid of water." Naaman turned sharply, his eyes burning. "Afraid?" he hissed. "Do you think fear binds me?" The soldier bowed his head. "No, my lord, but perhaps what binds you is yourself." Naaman's breath caught. The words stung. For a moment, neither spoke. The river murmured softly in the background, as if heaven itself was waiting for the next line of the story to be written. He dismissed the soldier with a gesture and stood, The sky above was heavy with clouds, the stars dimming as if the world were holding its breath. Naaman stepped closer to the water. The mud sank beneath his sandals. The chill bit his skin. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to return to Damascus, to the comfort of familiar pride. But somewhere beneath that noise another voice spoke. Quiet, persistent, divine. It wasn't the voice of thunder or prophecy. It was the whisper of mercy. He took one step into the river, then another. The current tugged at his robe, the chill wrapping around his legs. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and let himself sink to his knees. For the first time, the mighty bowed. He dipped once. The water ran cold over his hands, over the stains that marked his skin. Nothing changed. The leprosy still clung, stubborn as his pride. Twice. He felt the weight of the soldier's eyes behind him, watching, perhaps doubting, perhaps praying. The current whispered again, continue 3 times. His breath grew heavy. His mind screamed, foolishness. There is no power here. But his heart, his heart had begun to tremble with something new. Not fear, not shame, faith 4 times. The water clung to him like forgiveness. Each drop seemed to wash away not the disease, but the arrogance that had blinded him. 5 times. His tears mixed with the river. For a man who had never cried, it felt like breaking a curse. 6 times. The sky rumbled faintly. Somewhere, perhaps unseen, angels leaned close, and then the 7th. He plunged beneath the water fully, surrendering everything he was. His crown, his rank, his identity. For a heartbeat, the river swallowed him. A man stripped bare before God. When he rose, gasping, the surface broke like a veil being torn. His men shouted. Some fell to their knees. The moonlight struck his face, and the stains were gone. His skin, once scarred and pale, was now whole, smooth like that of a newborn child. Naaman stood frozen. The water dripped from his hands like liquid silver. He looked down at himself, at the skin that no longer burned, at the flesh that no longer bled. The miracle was not quiet. It was alive. He stumbled back to the shore, trembling. His knees gave way. He fell onto the mud, pressing his hands into it, weeping like a child. The proud general, the conqueror of nations, lay in the dirt of Israel, overcome by grace. The men watched in awe. None dared to speak. The air felt charged, sacred. It was as if time itself paused to witness what heaven had done. When Naaman finally stood, his eyes no longer carried the fire of pride but the light of understanding. Now I know, he whispered, voice breaking, that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. But the conflict was not over. Not yet, because miracles test the heart as much as faith does. He returned to Elisha's house, this time walking, not riding. His soldiers followed in silence. The door opened slowly and Naaman stood before the prophet, the man he had once dismissed. His voice trembled, humbled. Now I know, he said again, that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Please accept this gift from your servant. Elisha's eyes were calm, his tone firm. As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept it. Naaman pressed him. The prophet refused again. In that refusal was a lesson deeper than any sermon. The miracle could not be bought, only believed. Naaman bowed his head. Then allow me, I pray, to take 2 mule loads of earth from this land. For your servant will never again offer burnt offering or sacrifice to any god but the Lord. In that moment, Naaman's faith became something tangible, carried in the dust of Israel's soil. But faith is never born without resistance. Even as he returned home, questions haunted him. How would his king react? What would his people say? Could a man of Aram worship the God of Israel without losing everything he had built? The journey back to Damascus was long and heavy. The songs of victory were gone. Instead, silence filled the air. The silence of transformation. Naaman looked at his healed hands, at the smoothness that now covered where death once lived, and whispered prayers to the God he did not yet fully understand. But even miracles cast shadows. At the prophet's house, Elisha's servant Gehazi watched Naaman's departure with envy. His eyes followed the gifts, silver, gold, garments, things Elisha had refused. Temptation crept like smoke. Later, Gehazi would chase after Naaman, lie in Elisha's name and take the gifts secretly. But that too would not go unpunished. For God sees not only the proud general who humbles himself, but also the servant who corrupts mercy for greed. In heaven's balance, every heart is weighed. That night, as Naaman's chariot moved across the quiet sands, a single star fell across the sky, a silent witness to redemption born from obedience. He was not the same man who had left Damascus. The armor still gleamed, but beneath it was something stronger than iron: humility. And though the world would remember Naaman as the leper healed in the Jordan, heaven would remember him differently, as the proud man who finally bowed. Still, one question lingered like the last ember after a fire. Why had God chosen him, a foreigner, a man of war, to receive such mercy? Perhaps the answer was never in the water, but in the heart that dared to kneel before it. And that's when the unseen thread of prophecy began to weave into generations yet unborn. The journey from Damascus to the Jordan was long, hot, and humiliating. The sun blazed above Naaman and his entourage as the horses kicked up trails of dust behind them. His armor, once polished and gleaming, now felt like a prison of shame. Every glance from his soldiers seemed to whisper disbelief. Our commander is going to bathe in a muddy river? Naaman could feel their eyes. His pride screamed at him to turn back. I am Naaman, conqueror of nations, right hand to the king. Am I to strip down and dip myself like a beggar in front of my men? The thought cut deeper than the disease on his skin. But then came the soft, trembling voice of his servant, the same one who had convinced him to come this far. Master, he said gently, if the prophet had asked you to do something great, to climb a mountain, to slay a beast, to offer a sacrifice of gold, you would have done it. But because he asks something small, you hesitate. The words struck Naaman's heart like lightning. It wasn't just about obedience, it was about surrender. The commander who commanded thousands could not command his own pride. He stared at the brown, sluggish waters of the Jordan. It was nothing like the majestic rivers of Damascus, the Abana and the Pharpar, that flowed clear and beautiful. This was filth. The prophet had called him to wash in filth. For a long moment he stood still. The soldiers waited in silence. The air hung thick with dust and tension. Then Naaman made a sound that none expected, the metallic ring of armor falling to the ground. Piece by piece he removed it. The heavy plates, the shining helmet, the sword that marked his glory, all lay down upon the earth. When the armor was gone, the truth of his condition was revealed. The leprosy covered his skin in white patches, shameful, fragile, unholy. Gasps filled the air as his men saw what he had hidden for so long. Naaman lowered his gaze and stepped into the river. The water was cold and murky, clinging to him like clay. His heart pounded, once, twice, thrice. Each dip felt like a battle, not against disease, but against himself. By the fourth dip, his pride began to crumble. By the fifth, his heart began to soften. By the sixth, his tears mixed with the river's mud, and then, the seventh time, he rose from the water breathless. The wind fell silent. Even the birds seemed to pause. He looked down at his arms, and what he saw made his soul tremble. The spots were gone. The white scars vanished. His skin, once ruined and pale, now shone like the skin of a newborn child. Smooth, pure, whole. Naaman stood frozen in the middle of the Jordan, trembling not from cold, but from awe. He had expected healing. What he received was rebirth. He fell to his knees in the river, his hands shaking, water dripping from his face as he whispered, "There is no God in all the earth but in Israel." For the first time in his life, Naaman, the mighty warrior, bowed not to a king, not to an idol, but to the invisible hand of the one true God. When he emerged from the river, the world looked different. The same trees, the same stones, the same sunlight, yet all carried a divine glow. His soldiers stared in stunned silence. Some fell to their knees. Others covered their faces. None dared speak. Naaman wrapped himself in his cloak, not out of pride now, but humility. He felt the warmth of life in his skin again, and with it a strange peace he had never known. They traveled back to Elisha's house. But this time Naaman didn't ride his horse ahead of the others. He walked beside his servants. His heart, once arrogant, now beat with gratitude. When Elisha appeared, Naaman fell to the ground before him. "Please," he said, "accept these gifts, silver, gold, and fine garments. For what you have done for me no price could repay." But Elisha refused, his face calm, his voice steady. "As surely as the Lord lives whom I serve, I will not accept a thing." Naaman begged, but the prophet would not yield. For this miracle was not a transaction. It was grace, undeserved, unearned. Naaman's voice broke. Then please, let me take with me 2 mule loads of earth from Israel, so that I may never again make sacrifices to any god but the Lord. And so, the Syrian general who came seeking a cure left carrying dirt, a symbol of the new foundation of his faith. But before he departed, he hesitated and said softly, "There is one thing I ask forgiveness for. When my king goes to worship in the temple of Rimmon, and I must bow beside him as his servant, may the Lord pardon your servant for this." Elisha smiled faintly. "Go in peace," he said. Naaman mounted his horse. The same road that once carried a proud warrior now carried a humbled man. His soldiers watched him, and though none spoke, they knew. They had witnessed a man's soul being cleansed along with his skin. For in the muddy river of Jordan, God had written a message for all eternity. Sometimes the path to purity runs through the waters of humility. The sun was sinking low when Naaman crossed back into the borders of Syria. The road home felt strangely unfamiliar. The same stones, the same scent of dust and cedar, yet every step carried the weight of revelation. His heart, once armored in arrogance, now beat in rhythm with something higher. He had left his leprosy behind in the Jordan, but also something else, the illusion of control. His soldiers rode in silence. They had seen his transformation with their own eyes. They had seen his flesh restored, yes, but more striking was his spirit. The Naaman who had left Damascus was a man of thunder and command. The Naaman who returned was a man who carried stillness. His voice was gentler, his gaze softer. There was no longer a man atop a pedestal, only a soul made human by grace. As they neared the great gates of Damascus, trumpets blared, the city welcoming back its victorious commander. Children ran alongside the horses, merchants paused mid-trade, and even the palace guards saluted as Naaman entered. But beneath the shouts and cheers, Naaman's heart felt distant. He had won many battles, yet none so strange and sacred as this one. When he dismounted before the palace, the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad himself, stepped forward with outstretched arms. "Naaman, my brother," the king exclaimed, his golden robe shimmering in the twilight. "You have returned. Tell me, what did the prophet of Israel do? Did he chant? Did he lift his staff? Did he call fire from heaven?" Naaman bowed deeply. "No, my lord," he said, his voice steady.
"He did none of those things." The king laughed, thinking it jest.
"Then how were you healed?" Naaman lifted his gaze. "By obedience," he said softly. "By the hand of the God of Israel." The laughter died instantly. The court fell silent. The word Israel hung in the air like a blade. To the Syrians, Israel's God was foreign, a lesser deity, a rival among many. To the king, he was the God of their enemies. "Naaman," the king said carefully, "you speak strange words. You mean to tell me that their God healed you?" Naaman nodded. "Yes, my lord. There is no God in all the earth but him." Gasps echoed through the hall. The king's face stiffened, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Surely you do not mean to abandon the temple of Rimmon where you have worshipped since youth." Naaman's heart ached. He looked at the familiar marble floors, the torches burning with fragrant oil, the faces of men he had led into countless battles, and yet everything seemed hollow now. "My lord," he said gently, "I will serve you as always. But in my heart, I will bow only to the God who healed me." The king's expression faltered, anger flickering, then pity, then something unreadable. "Do as you will," he murmured. "Just do not speak of this too loudly." Naaman bowed again, but his heart swelled with conviction. He knew what the king feared, that faith once kindled spreads like fire. That night, when the palace grew quiet and the torches dimmed, Naaman walked to his private courtyard. The 2 mules stood tethered nearby, burdened with the soil he had carried from Israel. Carefully, reverently, Naaman spread the earth upon the ground. The Syrian wind blew gently across it, scattering dust like incense. He knelt upon that patch of sacred soil, foreign land upon his homeland, and whispered, "Here, Lord, will I worship you, not in marble halls or golden temples, but on the earth of obedience." The stars shimmered above him. For the first time, the heavens didn't feel distant. They felt alive, watching, listening. Days turned into weeks. Naaman resumed his duties as commander, but everything he touched bore new meaning. When he inspected the soldiers, he thought of obedience. When he strategized wars, he remembered humility. And when he saw the sick begging at the gates, he saw himself, the man he used to be, and would dismount to give food and comfort. Rumors spread quickly. The mighty Naaman bows to the God of Israel. Some mocked. Some whispered that the river had bewitched him. Others, those who saw his healed skin, wondered if perhaps the foreign god was not so foreign after all. And yet, not everyone was pleased. The priests of Rimmon grew restless. The chief priest, a man named Harib, summoned Naaman privately. "Commander," Harib began, his tone oily but dangerous, "we have heard strange things, that you no longer honor the God of our fathers." Naaman's eyes were calm. "I honor the one who healed me." Harib's lips tightened. "Careful, Naaman. The gods do not take betrayal lightly." Naaman stepped closer, his presence towering yet serene. "Then tell your gods this," he said. "The one I serve is not made by hands of men. He does not live in temples or feed on sacrifices. He lives where truth is obeyed." The priest paled and quickly dismissed him. But the seed was planted, a whisper that would travel through the city, through soldiers' camps, through market stalls. Naaman has found a greater God. Weeks later, during a state ritual, the king entered the grand temple of Rimmon, and Naaman walked beside him. The air smelled of incense and fear. As the king bent his knee before the idol, Naaman bowed too, not to the stone before him, but to the invisible presence in his heart. He remembered Elisha's words, "Go in peace," and in that moment Naaman understood. Faith was not always freedom from duty. It was the courage to remain faithful in the midst of darkness. That night, as he left the temple, a gentle rain began to fall. Naaman lifted his hands to the sky, feeling the droplets soak into his skin. It reminded him of the Jordan, the river of humiliation that became the river of healing. And deep within his soul, he heard the whisper of the same God who had met him there. "You were not cleansed because the water was holy. You were cleansed because you humbled yourself to obey." Naaman closed his eyes and smiled. He finally understood what Elisha never said aloud. The miracle was never in the river. It was in the surrender. From that night onward, Naaman lived quietly, a man of authority who bowed to no idol. He became a secret witness in a land of disbelief, a living testimony that the God of Israel could reach beyond borders, beyond kingdoms, beyond pride. And though history remembers him as a foreign general, heaven remembers him as something far greater, a man who found purity in muddy waters and light in enemy soil. Years passed. Seasons rolled like the waves of a forgotten sea, and the city of Damascus moved on. Bustling markets, wars fought and forgotten, kings rising and falling. But deep within the heart of Syria, there lived a quiet man whose story could not be erased by time. Naaman, once the mighty commander feared across borders, had become something entirely different. His name was no longer spoken with fear, but with wonder. Some called him the Healed One. Others whispered, "The man who met Israel's God." He had grown older now, his beard streaked with silver, his stride slower, yet his eyes brighter than ever before. In his courtyard, under the olive tree he had planted on the soil brought from Israel, Naaman often sat in silence. He would watch the wind move through the leaves and remember the sound of the Jordan's current, that humble river which had become his doorway to grace. Servants still came to him for guidance. Soldiers still sought his counsel, but they found in him something far greater than wisdom. They found peace. It wasn't the peace of a man who had conquered the world. It was the peace of one who had been conquered by God. One evening, a young servant approached Naaman. His name was Hadar, curious, eager, full of questions. He had been born long after Naaman's healing, but the tale had become legend in Damascus. "Master," the boy asked softly, "is it true you were healed in the river of Israel?" Naaman smiled faintly. "Yes, Hadar, in the Jordan." The boy frowned. "But they say it was dirty, muddy, not fit for a commander of armies." Naaman laughed gently. "That is true, my boy. It was filthy. Yet in its filth I found the cleanest truth of all." Hadar tilted his head. "How can something dirty make you clean?" Naaman's gaze turned distant, as if he could see that river shimmering once more under the prophet's command. "Because obedience," he said slowly, "is not about where you bow but why you bow. I thought honor would save me. But pride is a sickness no water can wash. Only surrender can." The boy listened in awe. "And this God, the God of Israel, he healed you?" Naaman nodded. Yes, but more than my skin, he healed the blindness of my heart. For a long time, Hadar said nothing. He only stared at his master, seeing in him something no title or metal could describe. That night, the boy crept back into his small quarters and whispered a prayer. Not to Rimmon, the god of stone his parents had taught him about, but to the invisible God who had healed Naaman. And perhaps somewhere in heaven, the same river that once cleansed Naaman rippled again, carrying faith from one soul to another. Years faded into decades. Naaman's story spread across borders like wind over sand. Some travelers brought it to Tyre, others to Egypt and even beyond. Scholars debated whether it was legend or truth, but among the humble the tale found home. It was whispered in marketplaces, sung in old songs. There was once a proud man who dipped in a humble river and rose a new creation. Even among Israel, the story lingered. Generations later, when prophets spoke of faith and mercy, they remembered Naaman, the foreigner who believed when others doubted. And centuries later still, a voice in Galilee would mention him again. Jesus of Nazareth, standing before his own people, said, "There were many lepers in Israel in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." Those words echoed across time, a divine reminder that God's grace knows no borders, no titles, no nations. That sometimes the purest faith comes not from those born under the promise, but from those who stumble upon it in desperation. In heaven's record, Naaman's name was not written under warrior or general, but under believer. And though he lived and died in a foreign land, his heart never left that sacred moment by the Jordan. On the night Naaman passed away, the air was still. His servants found him in his courtyard, sitting beneath the olive tree, hands folded upon his knees, eyes closed as if in prayer. Before him lay a small basin filled with water. They said he had been looking into it before his last breath, perhaps seeing not his reflection but the memory of a river where he met the living God. They buried him quietly. No grand procession, no trumpet, just the sound of the wind, the whisper of leaves, and the tears of those who had seen his transformation. But the people of Damascus never forgot. Some said that after his death, when the first rain of the season fell upon the city, it turned the dust to the same color as the Jordan, a sign that the God who once healed a foreign commander had not forgotten his faith. And centuries later, when the scrolls of kings and prophets were read, his story still stood, small in length yet boundless in meaning. Because Naaman's journey was not just a miracle of healing, it was a revelation of divine mercy that crossed enemy lines. It told the world that the God of Israel was not just theirs. He was the God of all who seek, all who humble, all who believe. Even today, when people read his story, they find themselves reflected in his struggle. The battle between pride and surrender, doubt and faith, command and obedience. Every believer in some way must step into their own Jordan, the place where self must die so the soul can live. Naaman's legacy is not written in stone or scripture alone. It is written in every heart that has ever resisted God, then finally said, "I will obey, even if I don't understand." Because that is the essence of faith, to trust the divine hand even when it points toward muddy waters. And so, the man who once sought healing in silver and status discovered something eternal, that God's cleanest miracles are often hidden in the dirtiest places, and his greatest victories are found not in conquest, but in surrender. The wind moves still over the ruins of Damascus, carrying whispers of his name. Somewhere, perhaps by the Jordan's ancient banks, the water glimmers faintly under the sun, as if remembering the day it carried heaven's touch to a broken man who believed. And if you listen closely to that wind, it almost sounds like a prayer. The river may be dirty, but the God who commands it makes it holy. The night was silent over the desert, except for the soft breath of the wind whispering across the sands, the same wind that had once carried the prophet's words, the same wind that had rippled the muddy waters of the Jordan. It was as though time itself bowed before the memory of that miracle, unwilling to let it fade. In the stillness of eternity, Naaman's story did not end. It continued, not as history, but as a revelation echoing through ages, a divine mirror reflecting the truth about the human soul. Naaman's healing was not just a moment of skin restored. It was prophecy, living, breathing prophecy, a story God wrote through a man who least expected to become his messenger. Because Naaman, the foreigner, the outsider, the man of war, was chosen not to show Israel's strength, but to expose its weakness. When Elisha's own people doubted, when they refused to bow, when they saw miracles and still hardened their hearts, a man from their enemy's camp came and believed. He came covered in disease, wrapped in pride, armed with gold and glory, and left naked of all but faith. That is the divine irony that makes this story burn brighter than most. That the river of Israel, despised by Israel's enemies, became the place where God revealed his mercy to one of them. The Jordan River, dirty, ordinary, overlooked, became heaven's testing ground. God could have healed Naaman in Damascus through royal priests and sacred temples, but instead, he sent him to a prophet who would not even greet him face to face, and commanded him to bathe in what looked like filth, because true faith is never about ceremony. It is about surrender. In the eyes of heaven, obedience is the purest worship, and humility, the holiest altar. As Naaman's flesh was renewed, so too was a covenant, not written in stone, but in spirit. The miracle whispered a secret Israel had long forgotten, that God's heart was not bound by borders or bloodlines. His mercy could cross rivers and kingdoms. It could reach anyone humble enough to receive it. Centuries later, that same truth would rise again, when another man stepped into the Jordan, not to be cleansed of disease, but to cleanse the world of its sin. Jesus, the Son of God, entered those same waters, sanctifying them forever. The river that once washed Naaman's leprosy would one day witness the dawn of salvation itself. The Jordan became the meeting place between two covenants, the cleansing of the flesh and the redemption of the soul. Naaman's dipping was a shadow of baptism to come, where the proud are broken and the broken are made new. And perhaps that was the mystery hidden in plain sight all along, that God was writing his eternal story through the life of a Syrian soldier, showing that faith, not heritage, opens the door to grace. When Naaman knelt on foreign soil, praying to Israel's God in secret, heaven smiled, because in that humble courtyard in Damascus, surrounded by idols of stone, a new altar was built, one invisible to human eyes but seen clearly by the angels. And from that altar, a light began to flicker, unsmall at first, but destined to grow. For every heart that humbles itself becomes part of that same light. Every soul that obeys against reason stands in the same lineage of faith as Naaman, a man who learned that holiness often wears the disguise of humiliation. In the heavens, perhaps Naaman's name stands among the faithful, alongside Abraham's trust, Ruth's devotion, and Rahab's courage. For faith is not about where you were born, but where you bow. And through his story, God speaks still. I will use the humble to shame the proud. I will use what is unclean to reveal what is pure. I will use the water men despise to show the mercy they deny. The dirty river was never dirty in God's sight. It was sacred, not because of what it was, but because of what it became, a place of meeting between heaven and humility. Naaman's leprosy, his pride, his journey, it all pointed toward a truth larger than himself, that the path to purity runs through surrender, and that the greatest miracles are not seen by the eyes, but by the heart that finally yields. And so the story of Naaman remains not as a relic, but as a revelation, that every act of obedience ripples through eternity, that even a nameless river can become a vessel of divine power when touched by faith. The wind moves across the Jordan still, carrying the memory of a man who stepped in dirty water and came out new. Each ripple of that river whispers the same eternal truth. Do not despise the simple things through which God works, for in what seems small, heaven hides its greatest power. Because when God wanted to perform a clean miracle, he chose a dirty river and a humbled heart. And through that he revealed something that outlived kings, empires, and nations, that grace, once given, never fades. It travels like the current, from soul to soul, from river to eternity. The story of Naaman ends quietly. No thunder, no fire from heaven, no tablets etched in stone. Just the sound of water, and a man learning what it means to bow. Yet across the centuries, that humble sound still echoes, louder than the trumpets of kings, deeper than the voices of prophets. Because Naaman's story is not about power or even healing. It's about the moment when pride finally falls silent and faith begins to speak. We often imagine miracles as lightning, sudden, blinding, impossible to miss. But sometimes miracles arrive softly, like ripples in muddy water. They come in the very places we refuse to look, in the people we overlook, the rivers we call dirty, the commands we think are beneath us. Naaman discovered that truth the hard way. He had gold, rank, servants, and authority, everything the world bows to. Yet heaven waited until he bowed first. That's the heart of this story, not the cleansing of skin, but the cleansing of spirit. When Naaman dipped beneath the water, he didn't just wash away disease. He washed away the illusion of control, the fortress of self. He learned that obedience is not humiliation. It is the door through which glory enters. And today, his story still speaks to us, to the proud, the broken, the uncertain, to those standing at the edge of their own Jordan, hesitating to step in because the command doesn't make sense, because the water looks dirty, because faith feels foolish. But Naaman's life reminds us, obedience often feels foolish before it looks miraculous. There are moments in every believer's journey when God asks us to step into the unexpected, to forgive when we want revenge, to love when we want silence, to trust when everything feels lost. And each time the command seems small, even absurd, yet within those moments lies the power to transform our entire soul. Naaman's healing is not ancient history. It is a reflection of our daily struggle, between pride and surrender, between what we see and what God sees. The same God who cleansed Naaman still calls us to step into faith's waters today, not because the water is holy, but because humility is. And perhaps that's the most beautiful truth of all, that God never needed a clean river to perform a clean miracle. He only needed a willing heart. The Jordan was just a vessel. The real transformation happened the moment Naaman obeyed. So when life feels unclear, when you stand before muddy waters, uncertain of their purpose, remember Naaman. Remember that God's instructions, no matter how small, are never without reason. The place that looks like shame may become your place of breakthrough. The act that feels beneath you may become the bridge between despair and healing. Faith does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and those who listen, who step forward, trembling but trusting, find that the dirty river becomes the cleanest path of all. Naaman's story teaches us that God's mercy is larger than nations, deeper than rivers, and stronger than pride. It reaches beyond borders, beyond traditions, beyond logic, to any soul humble enough to receive it. And maybe in the end, that is what holiness truly means. Not perfection, but surrender. Not understanding every detail, but obeying even when you don't. So let Naaman's story linger in your heart tonight. Let it remind you that divine miracles often begin in unlikely places, with unlikely people doing unlikely things. That the same God who turned a dirty river into a fountain of grace still waits to turn your doubt into faith, your burden into blessing, your weakness into testimony. Because the river still flows, the invitation still stands, and the voice that once spoke to a proud soldier still whispers to every heart that dares to listen. Step in. Trust me. The water may look unclean, but I will make you whole. If this story of Naaman's pride, pain, and ultimate cleansing has touched your heart, I invite you to reflect. How many times has God asked you to dip into the muddy waters of faith before showing his power? Sometimes the miracle lies not in the river, but in our surrender. If you felt the presence of that truth today, don't leave without sharing this story. Like, comment, and subscribe to Legends of Bible, Mystery, plus Emotion, plus Suspense. New revelations await, where ancient souls whisper through the pages of time. Your faith story might be next.